You are listening to Proof Text, a Glossa House podcast exploring Scripture and all things related to it. New episodes are released daily. For more information, check out glossahouse.com and subscribe to our channels on Spotify and YouTube. Welcome and enjoy.
Shalom and welcome to another episode of SLA Insights. My name is Dr. Jennifer Noonan, and I'm going to be continuing a discussion of vocabulary acquisition, how best to learn vocabulary that I started in the previous episode. The previous episode I talked about aspects of knowing a word, how we know a word, the different complex factors involved in knowing a word. Starting with this episode, I'm going to be unpacking some of the factors that affect the way we learn and retain vocabulary. So in this episode, I'm going to cover two specifically, and then in future episodes, I will pick up some of the others. So just by way of introduction, the knowing and learning vocabulary is a complex process. It's more than just memorizing the backside of a flashcard. And so there are a number of factors that are going to influence the way you learn and then retain those vocabulary items. Several of those factors include motivation for learning, noticing, whether you notice the word to begin with, retrieval of that word, creative use of the vocabulary item, and interference. Now, as I said, in this episode, I'm just going to cover the first two, motivation and noticing, and then in upcoming episodes, I'm going to address some of the other factors that will affect how well we learn and retain the vocabulary items in a second language. So the first one, motivation, in very general terms, we are more motivated to learn things that we enjoy. We're more motivated to retain things that we're engaged in doing. Now, on this very general level, I'm going to discuss in future episodes when we talk about the affective filter and student factors that affect language acquisition. But for vocabulary learning specifically, the salience of the word is going to be a motivating factor of whether the word is retained or learned in the first place. And by this, I mean, how important is it? So, for example, if the target vocabulary item is necessary or critical for understanding the plot of a story, a student's going to be more motivated to learn it. If it's kind of what's seen, at least by the learner, as a throwaway item, then they're going to be less motivated to learn it. And so, by extension, logically, if you're the teacher, you want to make those items more important in the student's mind to give them motivation for learning it. And we'll talk a little bit more about that towards the end of this episode. The second factor then is noticing. Now, this can be conscious or subconscious noticing. And if it is noticed, either consciously or subconsciously, then there's going to be a greater likelihood that the learner is going to actually latch onto it for recognizing it as something that's useful and needs to be learned. But what makes a learner notice a word? Well, there are several things, internal factors and external factors. On the internal side of things, if the student has had previous contact with the word, they're more likely to notice it. Now, keep in mind that it's going to take multiple exposures to a word to really learn it, somewhere in the neighborhood of 7 to 10 exposures. And so just because they've had previous contact with it does not mean they have actually learned it. And so previous contact is one internal factor that's going to make them more likely to notice it and say, oh, I think I've seen this before. And so they'll be more likely to pick it up in this or future exposures to that word. Another, and this is where this noticing overlaps with motivation, the word fills in a gap in his or her knowledge. For example, maybe she needs a word for for holy and realizes I haven't come across that, at this point, that word becomes important and noticed, and the student is ready to acquire it. Salience, again, related to motivation, is another factor that's going to lead to a student noticing a word. Is it important for understanding the text that I'm reading at the moment? So those are some of the internal factors that lead to noticing. And again, noticing leads to vocabulary acquisition. But then there are some external factors that can increase the likelihood of noticing. For example, if the teacher or the student removes the word from context for further processing and investigation, maybe looking it up in a dictionary, that kind of a thing, that is definitely going to lead to noticing and hopefully learning and retention. Relatedly, deliberately studying the word in perhaps a word study, guessing the meaning from context is another. If the student is reading along, recognizes that he or she does not know the word in question, and says, I think based on context, the root of the word, I think it might mean this. He or she, just by virtue of spending a little more time on the word, has noticed it and will make it more likely for acquisition. And then finally, having the word explained by a teacher or a knowledgeable peer will also affect noticing. If the teacher stops and says, hey, you need to look at this word a little bit more, let me give you a little background on the culture or whatever it is, then the student is more likely to notice it and thereby acquire it. So those are some internal and external factors that would lead to a student noticing the word and therefore making it more likely to be picked up, acquired. So how can an instructor use these two factors to promote vocabulary acquisition? You've probably already been thinking about a few yourself, but here's a few suggestions. First, in terms of motivation, you want to choose your L2 text, your second language text, where the target vocabulary item or items is central, necessary for understanding the text itself. And if you don't have a text that has those requirements, perhaps you want to create your own or adapt what you have so that that new target item is absolutely necessary for understanding the full sentence or paragraph that you're working with. So that's going to help improve motivation for learning the vocabulary item. But then in terms of noticing, again, you want to choose or create or adapt texts that have previously encountered vocabulary items. Don't think just because they've seen it once, they've got it. Give it to them again and they can say, oh yeah, I've seen this word, what was it? And that extra thought is going to promote learning and acquisition. You may also want to spend time highlighting a word or two with a mini word study in class, or assign a word study as homework, or create a video to post online on a single vocabulary item that gives them maybe your own word study on that particular word, or some cultural relevance for the word, why it works the way it does, that kind of a thing. It will go a long way to reinforcing and encouraging the acquisition of that item. Now, another strategy to help with noticing is to practice and encourage guessing from context. Now, I can already hear your complaints. We don't want them to guess. We want them to know. Of course you do, okay? But again, if it takes 7 to 10 exposures to a word, why not make the first exposure a guessing game? And not only that, it's going to add value in terms of how it helps the student be ready for the meaning when it comes. For example, if they're guessing the word from context, they're invested in it. So when the meaning does come, when they get the meaning in the vocabulary list, when they've looked it up in the dictionary, when you've talked about it in class, they've already done some thinking about that word. They're primed and ready for the answer when it comes. And when it comes, then they can say, oh, I was right. Or, I was kind of right, I was on the right track, or wow, I really missed that. And just that much is an extra layer of laying down multiple memory traces for them to access that word later on. They've been primed, they're ready, and so when they do get the meaning, they're invested and they're really ready to take in the meaning of that word. So that's one value of guessing from context. A second is for them to start learning how to recognize and reinforcing their recognition of parts of speech. Just at the very basic level, even if they don't know the meaning of the word, can they at least figure out, well, is it a noun? Is it a verb? Is it an adverb? That kind of a thing is going to promote further learning of the language. It's also going to promote them learning word roots and word parts. Maybe they can look at the word and go, yeah, I see this root in the word, but it's got a prefix or a suffix or an infix that I'm not sure I recognize. And so even that much is going to reinforce and encourage them to go, okay, if I learn these word parts, it may help me down the road to figure out what these words are. And very generally, guessing from context is going to promote critical thinking about language, how language works, what they know, what they don't know about the language. So there's definitely value in guessing words from context. And I would encourage you to teach your students some strategies for guessing from context, such as word parts. Is it a part, what part of speech it is, that kind of a thing, to help them do that on their own and promote vocabulary acquisition. So, for today, looking at a couple factors that are going to affect and influence the way learners acquire vocabulary. And two factors I talked about today are motivation and noticing. The motivation of for vocabulary learning is very much dependent on the salience of the word. How important is that word in the text they're reading? The noticing has various levels and different factors, including salience, one of them being internal factors such as, I've already seen this word, I want to know what this word means, and external factors like the teacher has made me focus on it, or a fellow student has explained the meaning to me, that kind of a thing. So those are just two. There are several other factors that are going to affect the way students learn, acquire, retain vocabulary. And so in the next episode, I'm going to cover a few more of these. So I hope you can join me to look at more factors of vocabulary acquisition. And in the meantime, have a great week.
Interested in growing your ancient language skills but not sure where to start? Glossa House can help. From illustrated readers and short stories to lexicons and grammars, Glossa House offers a variety of resources for beginning, intermediate, and experienced ancient language learners. Head to glossahouse.com today. Glossa House, language resources for the global community.